Somewhere on the seafloor, past the point where sunlight means anything at all, there's a submarine that has been sitting in the dark for more than 80 years. Not resting. Not preserved the way people imagine a time capsule to be preserved. Collapsed, spread across a debris field, half buried in sediment that has been drifting down onto it since before most of our grandparents were born. And according to researchers who have spent years chasing its story, somewhere inside or around that wreck is gold. A lot of it. This episode is about that submarine, not a surface ship, not a merchant vessel that hit a reef or got torpedoed in a shipping lane. A submarine built for one purpose, sent on a mission that historians still argue about the details of carrying cargo that may have been worth more than the vessel itself was ever worth as a weapon. The vessel most closely tied to this story, the one researchers and historians point to most often when this kind of case comes up, is the Japanese submarine I-52. According to historical accounts and later research efforts, I-52 was dispatched in 1944 on what's sometimes called a Yanagi mission, a secret submarine run between Axis powers during the war, meant to move strategic materials between Japan and Nazi Germany at a point in the war when surface shipping had become too dangerous to trust with anything valuable. Here's where it's important to slow down, because a lot of what circulates about this story blends two very different things together. There is documented history, and there is decades of added lore, speculation, and rounded up dollar figures that have attached themselves to that history the way barnacles attach to a hull. We're going to try to keep those separate the whole way through, because that separation is actually the point of this video. What is documented according to U.S. Navy records and post-war historical research is that a submarine matching I-52's profile was intercepted based on decoded radio intelligence, tracked by U.S. Navy aircraft operating from an escort carrier in the Atlantic and attacked in June of 1944. The submarine was reported sunk. That much sits on fairly solid ground, corroborated by wartime records on the American side. What becomes murkier, and where the lore starts layering in, is the manifest. Reports developed after the war and expanded by researchers and salvage companies decades later describe a found 52 as carrying a significant quantity of gold bullion, along with tin, rubber, quinine, and other materials Germany badly needed by that stage of the war. Some of the specific weight figures for the gold that circulate today trace back to post-war intelligence summaries and later research funded by parties with a direct financial interest in the wreck being worth searching for. That doesn't mean the figures are false. It means they deserve exactly the caution we're going to give them throughout this video, because the difference between a wartime record and a modern estimate matters enormously once money and salvage rights enter the picture, which they will at length later in this episode. For decades after the sinking, none of this mattered practically because nobody could find the wreck. Not because nobody wanted to, because a submarine, once it goes down in deep water, disappears in a way a surface ship almost never does. And understanding exactly why that is turns out to be the key to understanding everything that happened next, including why this particular wreck sat completely undisturbed for close to 50 years after the war ended. Before we get to the discovery, we need to talk about the mission itself a little more, because the choice to use a submarine for this kind of cargo run wasn't incidental. By 1944, Allied control of Atlantic shipping lanes had become close to absolute. Convoys were escorted, air patrols covered huge stretches of ocean, and a surface blockade runner attempting to cross from Asia to occupied Europe faced overwhelming odds of interception. A submarine moving submerged for most of its transit was the only realistic option left for moving anything valuable between the two Axis powers by sea. That's not lore. That's basic wartime logistics, and it's the reason this story exists as a submarine story instead of a shipwreck story, like most of what gets covered on this channel. It's also worth pausing on what that says about the cargo itself. Militaries do not risk a specialized, expensive, difficult-to-build vessel and a trained crew on a mission like this for something replaceable. If the reports of gold and strategic materials are accurate, even partially, it tells you how desperate the material situation had become on the receiving end and how much value both governments were willing to gamble on a single hull, making it across an ocean submerged, avoiding detection the entire way. So here's where the episode actually starts pulling apart the two threads we mentioned. Thread 1, a real submarine on a real documented mission, sunk in a real historically recorded engagement. Thread 2, a treasure story that grew up around that sinking over the following 80 years, shaped by post-war intelligence gaps, Cold War secrecy, and eventually, decades later, commercial salvage interest with a very direct financial motive to make the numbers sound as large as possible. Both threads are going to matter for the rest of this video, but only one of them is going to determine who legally owns anything found down there. And it isn't the exciting one. To understand why this submarine sat unfound for so long, you have to understand something most treasure content skips right past. A submarine does not sink the way people picture a shipwreck sinking. When a surface ship goes down, it generally settles onto the sea floor in something close to one piece, or at least in large, recognizable sections, especially in shallower coastal water. Divers can often identify a hull shape, read a name off a bow, walk through what used to be a deck. That's the image most treasure documentaries lean on, because it's visually satisfying, and it matches what people already picture in their heads. A submarine sunk by depth charging or aerial attack in deep water almost never ends up looking like that. Submarines are pressure vessels. Their entire hull is engineered to resist the crushing force of deep water from the outside while holding a survivable, roughly 1 atmosphere environment on the inside. That's an extraordinary structural balancing act, and it only works as long as the hull stays intact. The moment that hull is breached, either by direct damage or by exceeding what's called crush depth as the vessel sinks, the physics flip completely. Instead of resisting external pressure, the hull becomes something water is trying to force its way into, violently, and it does. At depth, that's not a gentle flooding. It's an implosion. The pressure differential between the crushing weight of thousands of feet of ocean and the relatively low pressure inside an intact submarine hull is enormous. And when a whole section gives way, it can happen in a fraction of a second, with enough force to fold steel, rupture bulkheads, and scatter wreckage across a debris field that can stretch for hundreds of feet rather than staying in one recognizable shape. That matters enormously for search efforts for one very practical reason: side-scan sonar and the earlier generations of search technology used in the decades right after the war are looking for a shape. A hull-length return, something with a recognizable profile against the flat sea floor. An implosion doesn't leave you a hull-length shape. It leaves you a scattered field of pressure hull sections, debris, and cargo, spread and partially buried, sometimes over an area many times larger than the vessel's original footprint. Searching for that with 1950s or 1960s sonar technology in open ocean without a precise starting position was close to hopeless. And that's the other half of the problem. The starting position itself was never precise. Wartime attack reports, even good ones, are built from a moving aircraft's estimated position, current and drift calculations, and the observed location of an attack that often happened at night or in poor visibility. A reported sinking position from 1944 can easily be off by miles once you're trying to use it to justify an expensive deep-water search decades later. Multiply a positional uncertainty of even a few miles across ocean depths that can exceed 15,000 feet in some parts of the Atlantic, and you get a search area covering many square miles of seafloor that nobody for most of the 20th century had the sonar resolution, the deep tow survey technology, or frankly, the financial motivation to methodically cover. Cold War era naval survey technology existed, but it was expensive. It was often classified, and it was rarely pointed at looking for 80-year-old cargo submarines when it had actual strategic uses like mapping seafloor terrain for missile submarine operations or searching for downed aircraft with intelligence value. A gold-bearing World War II wreck sat fairly low on anyone's government priority list for most of the post-war period, according to the historical record of search efforts, which is to say, there mostly weren't any organized ones until private commercial interest entered the picture much later. That's the quiet, unglamorous truth underneath most forgotten for decades treasure stories. And it applies here with extra force because of the submarine factor specifically. It wasn't a conspiracy keeping this wreck hidden. It was physics, imprecise wartime records, and expensive, immature search technology, stacked on top of each other for roughly 50 years. Surface shipwrecks in shallow coastal water get found by amateur divers and fishermen relatively often. Deep ocean submarine wrecks scattered by implosion, sitting under thousands of feet of open Atlantic water, essentially require purpose-built commercial deep-sea survey technology that didn't mature and become commercially accessible until the final decades of the 20th century, which is exactly when the story picks back up. By the early 1990s, deep ocean search technology had reached a point where a privately funded expedition could realistically attempt what governments had mostly left alone for decades. According to accounts from the search effort most closely associated with this case, a research and salvage company, backed by private investors with a direct financial stake in locating valuable wrecks, began combing archival wartime records, reassessing the reported attack coordinates from 1944, and cross-referencing them with declassified intelligence material that had become available in the years after the Cold War wound down. The breakthrough tool was side-scan sonar, towed behind a survey vessel at depth, sweeping the seafloor in overlapping passes, and building up an acoustic image of anything protruding from the sediment. According to reports from the expedition, a sonar contact consistent with a debris field rather than an intact hull was identified roughly 5,000 feet below the surface in the Atlantic, in a location that lined up with a refined estimate of the wartime attack position. A sonar contact alone doesn't confirm anything. It tells you there's something down there shaped roughly like wreckage. Confirming identity required a remotely operated vehicle, an ROV lowered on cable to actually put cameras on the site and look at what the sonar had found. According to the expedition's own reported account of the dive and later published descriptions of the footage, the ROV documented sections of pressure hull consistent with a Japanese submarine of that class, scattered wreckage rather than an intact vessel, and notably, what were described as visible ingots or bar-shaped objects among the debris, along with other cargo consistent with the manifest historians associate with the mission. This is a good place to slow down again, because consistent with and confirmed are doing very different jobs in that sentence, and a responsible telling of this story has to keep them separate. Identifying a wreck as a specific named submarine decades later on the seafloor generally relies on a combination of things: hull design and construction features matching the known class of vessel, the wreck's location matching the historical attack record closely enough to be plausible, and sometimes recovered artifacts with markings or serial features that narrow things down further. According to the salvage company's own published statements at the time, they were confident in the identification. Independent academic or governmental confirmation of every detail is harder to point to with the same certainty. And that gap between a salvor's confident public statement and independently verified fact is going to come up again later in this video because it matters legally as well as historically. As for the gold itself, reported estimates of the cargo's value drawn from the salvage company's public statements and amplified heavily in press coverage at the time put the bullion's worth at figures that have been cited anywhere from tens of millions of dollars up toward roughly $200 million, depending on the source, the year the estimate was made, and the gold price used in the calculation. That $200 million figure is the one that tends to circulate most widely today, and it's worth being direct about where it comes from. It is a reported estimate built on a combination of wartime cargo manifests of uncertain completeness and modern gold pricing applied after the fact, not a verified, audited, recovered total. Estimates like this have a habit of growing more precise sounding the more times they get repeated online without actually becoming more accurate. We're going to use the figure in this video because it's the one associated with this case in the public record, but we're using it the way it should be used, as a reported number, not a confirmed one. What is more concretely documented is the condition of the site itself. Deep, cold, low oxygen water slows corrosion dramatically compared to shallow coastal wrecks, which is part of why gold specifically survives so well in these environments, gold being famously resistant to corrosion in the first place. But the structural condition described by the ROV survey, a scattered debris field rather than an intact hull, meant that any recovery effort wasn't going to be a matter of opening a hatch and carrying bars out in a bag. It would mean identifying, mapping, and mechanically retrieving individual pieces of cargo from across a debris field spread over a significant area of seafloor under thousands of feet of water pressure, using specialized deep-sea recovery equipment. That's an enormously expensive undertaking even before a single ounce of gold changes hands. And that expense is exactly where the story stops being about sonar and ROVs and starts being about lawyers. Here's the part of the story that almost never gets covered properly in treasure content, and it's the reason this episode exists. Finding a sunken submarine and being legally allowed to keep what's inside it are two completely different problems, and for a military vessel specifically, the second problem is dramatically harder than most viewers assume. Start with the concept that governs most shipwreck treasure stories, admiralty law, and within it, two different legal frameworks that get confused constantly, even in serious reporting. The first is called the law of fines. Under the law of fines, if a court determines that property was abandoned, meaning the original owner intentionally gave up all rights to it, then whoever recovers it can potentially be awarded outright title, essentially becoming the new owner. This is the framework people are picturing when they imagine treasure hunters simply keeping what they find. The second framework is the law of salvage. Under the law of salvage, the original owner's title is not considered abandoned. The salvor who recovers the property doesn't become the owner. Instead, the salvor is entitled to a salvage award, essentially a court-determined payment or percentage for the service of rescuing the property, while ownership stays with whoever legally owned it in the first place or their legal successor. Which framework applies makes an enormous financial difference, and courts have leaned increasingly towards salvage rather than fines for shipwrecks over the past several decades, particularly for anything with a still identifiable, still existing owner. But here's the detail that changes everything for a submarine specifically, and it's the core legal point of this entire video. Warships occupy a different legal category from merchant vessels entirely under a doctrine called sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity applied to sunken military vessels holds that a warship remains the property of its originating government indefinitely unless that government explicitly abandons its claim through a formal, documented act, a treaty, or an agreement. It does not become abandoned property just because decades have passed, just because nobody came looking for it, and just because the original government never mounted its own recovery expedition. Silence is not abandonment under this doctrine. According to how courts and governments have consistently treated this category of case, a nation's warship, its equipment, and by extension, cargo associated with its official mission generally remains that nation's sovereign property on the seafloor, whether that seafloor sits in international waters or another country's territorial waters, unless there's a clear, affirmative, legal act saying otherwise. That single doctrine is why a submarine treasure story cannot follow the same script as a merchant shipwreck treasure story, and it's worth sitting with the implications for a moment. It means that, in principle, the originating government, in this case Japan, retains a legitimate ownership claim over Aussie 52 and cargo directly tied to its official wartime mission, regardless of how many decades pass, regardless of who finds it first, and regardless of how much money a private company spends locating and surveying it. Real precedent backs this up, and it's worth walking through cases that aren't the one at the center of this video, because seeing the pattern across multiple cases is what makes the legal argument land. Consider HMS Edinburgh, a British cruiser sunk in 1942 while carrying Soviet gold intended as payment for wartime supplies. When a salvage expedition recovered gold from Edinburgh in the early 1980s, the operation only proceeded under a formal agreement between the British and Soviet governments, negotiated specifically to authorize the salvage and divide the recovered gold between the two governments and the commercial salvor under a contracted percentage. Nobody simply sailed out, found the wreck, and kept what they pulled up. The legal foundation for that operation was a government-to-government agreement, not a court award to a private finder. Consider also the pattern seen repeatedly with sunken German U-boats discovered off various coastlines over the decades. Even wrecks found accidentally by fishermen or recreational divers, and even wrecks containing no cargo of obvious monetary value, have generally been treated by courts and by the German government as protected military sites rather than open salvage targets, precisely because of their sovereign status as former naval vessels, not merchant ships. Several U-boat wrecks have had recovery or disturbance restricted or prohibited entirely on exactly these grounds, regardless of the commercial interest divers or salvors expressed in artifacts aboard them. Applying that same pattern back to a Japanese cargo submarine sunk in 1944, carrying what may be gold intended for a wartime ally. Any legally sound recovery would realistically require some form of agreement involving the Japanese government, whether that's a licensing arrangement, a negotiated division of proceeds, or explicit authorization for a private company to conduct recovery on the government's behalf. A private salvage company simply locating the wreck, however impressive the sonar work and however real the historical research behind it, does not on its own establish legal ownership of sovereign wartime cargo. According to how courts have approached comparable cases, the company's strongest realistic legal position isn't ownership. It's a claim to a salvage award, negotiated or litigated, contingent on cooperation with, or at minimum, non-objection from, the government whose warship it actually is. That distinction, ownership versus a salvage award, is the single most important legal fact in this entire video. And it's the reason this particular treasure story doesn't end the way most shipwreck stories on this channel end. There's a second, quieter legal and ethical layer sitting underneath all of this, and it's one that deserves real weight, rather than a passing mention. A submarine lost in combat, with its crew still aboard, is not just a valuable wreck. According to standard treatment of military losses at sea, it is widely regarded as a war grave. Wartime accounts and post-war research into the sinking describe the vessel going down with its full crew still aboard. There's no record of survivors being recovered from the water in the aftermath of the attack most closely associated with this case. That means any recovery operation on this wreck isn't simply retrieving cargo from an empty hull sitting on the seafloor. It's operating at and potentially disturbing the resting place of the people who died there. Militaries and governments around the world have increasingly formalized this distinction over recent decades, treating certain classes of wartime wreck, particularly those with confirmed loss of life and no survivors recovered, as protected sites, similar in spirit to how a grave on land is protected from casual disturbance. That protection isn't always written into binding international law with the same force everywhere, and enforcement varies significantly depending on the country, the specific wreck, and whether anyone with legal standing chooses to act on it. But the ethical framing runs consistently through how governments, veterans organizations, and serious historians tend to discuss these sites as places where people died in service, not simply as shipping containers that happen to be full of something valuable. That framing creates a real, uncomfortable tension at the center of any submarine treasure story, this one included. On one side, there's genuine historical and scientific value in locating and studying these wrecks, documenting what happened, and in some cases, recovering material with legitimate archival, memorial, or even authorized economic value under proper government agreement. On the other side, there's a version of that same activity that reduces a crew's final resting place to a headline about how many hundreds of millions of dollars might be sitting on the ocean floor without much attention paid to the fact that people died getting that cargo to where it now sits. Serious researchers and historians involved in these kinds of cases tend to draw a fairly consistent line. Documentation, survey, and even limited recovery under formal government authorization is treated very differently, ethically, and legally from freelance salvage aimed primarily at extracting value with minimal government involvement or acknowledgement of the site's status as a grave. According to how these debates have generally played out in public commentary around comparable cases, treasure-focused coverage that leads with a dollar figure and buries the human cost in a single sentence near the end tends to draw the sharpest criticism from historians, veterans groups, and in some cases, the governments involved. It's worth being direct about where that leaves this particular case. The reported presence of a crew still aboard the wreck is one more reason, alongside sovereign immunity itself, that recovery here isn't simply a matter of technical capability and financial motivation. It's a reason governments have historically moved slowly, cautiously, and often not at all when a private company announces it has located a wreck like this one and begins talking publicly about potential cargo value. So where did all of this actually leave the case at the center of this video? Once the sonar contact was confirmed, the footage was public, and the estimated dollar figures had already spread through international press coverage. According to public reporting and the salvage company's own statements following the expedition, the discovery generated exactly the kind of headlines you'd expect. Eye-catching estimated dollar figures, dramatic framing around gold sitting untouched on the ocean floor for half a century, and renewed interest from investors and media in a follow-up recovery attempt. What it did not generate, according to the available record, was a clean, fast, legally uncomplicated path to bringing that gold to the surface and selling it. Reports from the years following the initial discovery describe a company associated with the search continuing to pursue additional survey and potential recovery work while facing the practical and legal reality outlined earlier in this video. Cargo tied to a sunken Japanese naval vessel's official wartime mission, sites under a sovereign immunity claim that doesn't simply evaporate because a private expedition found the wreck first. Any large-scale, legally durable recovery effort realistically required some form of engagement with the Japanese government, whether through licensing, a negotiated division of proceeds, or explicit authorization, none of which appear in the public record as having been fully finalized and executed at the scale the early press coverage implied was coming. That gap between announcement and resolution is common across this category of case, and it's worth naming directly rather than letting the story quietly fade out. High-profile deep-sea discoveries generate a predictable press cycle. Initial discovery, dramatic value estimates, talk of an imminent recovery operation, and then very often years of comparative silence while the legal, financial, and logistical realities of actually executing a deep water recovery under contested or unresolved ownership claims grind on far more slowly than a news cycle. Multiple well-known deep-sea treasure cases over the past several decades have followed roughly this same arc. Big discovery headline, followed by a long, quiet, legally tangled middle period that rarely gets the same coverage as the initial find. For this case specifically, the most defensible summary, staying strictly within what's documented rather than what's been speculated, is this. A wreck consistent with the submarine's known class and the historical attack location was identified via sonar and ROV survey in the early 1990s. Cargo consistent with gold bullion and other strategic materials was documented on camera at the site. Reported value estimates for that cargo, most commonly cited around the $200 million mark, come from the salvage company's own public statements combined with the contemporary gold pricing and should be treated as reported estimates rather than confirmed audited totals. No large-scale recovery of that cargo backed by a finalized government agreement resolving the sovereign immunity question appears in the public record as having been completed. As of the most recent publicly available reporting on this case, the cargo remains, as far as anyone outside the companies and governments directly involved can confirm, exactly where the ROV found it, on the seafloor, legally unresolved, physically undisturbed at scale. That's not the ending most treasure content wants to deliver because it doesn't have a triumphant recovery scene or a courtroom verdict with a dollar amount attached, but it's the honest one, and it's actually the more useful story to understand because it's the pattern that governs almost every sunken warship treasure case, not just this one. The gold not being recovered isn't a failure of the story, it's the story. A government's sovereign claim over a warship, a still unresolved question of who's actually entitled to authorized recovery, a crew that never came home being treated correctly as more than a footnote, and a wreck that technology finally located, but that law still, in a very real sense, keeps buried. If you've made it this far, you've now got a genuinely useful framework for evaluating every other submarine treasure story that crosses your feed after this one. Ask who the vessel actually belonged to, ask whether that government has ever formally abandoned its claim, and ask whether what you're looking at is a recovery or just a discovery with a big number attached to it. Those are two very different things, and this case is a clean example of exactly where that line sits.